The dishes were done. The kitchen was clean. I had made 4 school lunches, signed 2 permission slips, and spoken warmly to every single person in that house before 8 in the morning. And then I drove to work and did not think about any of them until 3 o'clock. That was the rhythm of it. That was how good I was at it. My name is Rosalind Ferry. I'm 74 years old. And for the better part of 2 decades, I told myself that loving 4 children equally was the same thing as loving each of them enough. It was not. I want to start with what kind of mother I actually was, because I think it matters that you understand this before anything else. I was not neglectful. I was not cold. I was the mother who showed up. Every recital, every game, every school conference, every fever at 2 in the morning. I cooked real food. I read bedtime stories until my voice gave out. I knew the names of my children's teachers and their best friends, and later, their first loves. My own mother had been a distracted woman, occupied with her own interior life in ways she never fully explained. And I had made a decision very early that I would not be that. I would be present. I would be fair. I would divide myself evenly among them, and no child of mine would ever feel unseen. That was the plan. That was the promise I made to myself the year my oldest, Diane, was born. 1974. I was 27 years old and entirely certain I knew what good mothering looked like. I had 4 children in 7 years. Diane first, then Marcus 2 years later, then Julia, then Thomas, who arrived in 1981, when Diane was already 7 and had opinions about sharing her bedroom. We lived in a house on Clement Street in a mid-sized city in Ohio that was just large enough for 4 children if nobody needed privacy, which children, it turns out, always do. My husband Gerald worked in hospital administration. I taught 4th grade, which meant I spent my days being patient and organized and emotionally available for other people's children. And then I came home and tried to be the same for my own. I was very organized. That is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about my mothering. I ran that house the way I ran my classroom, with structure, with fairness, with a consistent set of rules applied without favoritism. Everyone got the same bedtime. Everyone got the same allowance adjusted for age. Everyone got 30 minutes of individual time with me each week, which I actually scheduled, because if I didn't schedule it, it didn't happen. I was proud of that system. I told other mothers about it at school pickup. I genuinely believed, that fairness was the highest form of love I could offer. Diane was easy. That's the only word for it. She was organized like me, self-sufficient, did her homework without being asked, had friends, had opinions, knew how to fill a room. Marcus was quieter but steady, a boy who found one interest at a time and pursued it completely. First dinosaurs, then chess, then long-distance running. Julia was social in a way that slightly exhausted me, always needing people around her, always orchestrating something. But she was fundamentally cheerful, and her needs were legible. I knew how to meet them. And then there was Thomas. Thomas was my youngest by 4 years, which meant he arrived into a household that had already found its shape without him. He was a gentle child. That's the word I would have used at the time. And I meant it without really examining what I meant. Gentle, quiet, watchful. He played alone contentedly for hours. He didn't fight for attention the way younger siblings sometimes do. He just accommodated. Whatever was happening, Thomas accommodated it. We were busy, and Thomas was fine with that. We were distracted. and Thomas found things to occupy himself. He never demanded anything. I told myself this was a temperament. Some children are simply more self-contained. I told myself I was lucky. There was a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1989. Thomas was 8. I remember it specifically because it was the day of Julia's spring concert. She was in the school choir. She had a small solo. She had been talking about it for 3 weeks. Gerald was traveling for work. I had arranged for my neighbor Patrice to collect Thomas from school and keep him until the concert was over, because the concert ran long and it was a school night and there was no good way to bring an 8-year-old and manage Julia's nerves at the same time. Thomas was fine with this arrangement. Of course he was. He said okay and packed his backpack and went to Patrice's house, and I didn't think about him again until I picked him up at 8:30, and he was sitting at Patrice's kitchen table doing a puzzle by himself, very quietly, in that way he had. Patrice said he'd been perfectly fine all evening. I said I wasn't surprised. He's very independent. I remember feeling pleased by that. Independent. What a good quality in a child. I did not ask him how his day had been on the drive home. I was tired from the concert and managing Julia's post-performance emotions, which always ran high in both directions. I got everyone to bed. I folded the laundry. I went to sleep. It was not a dramatic evening. That's precisely the point. There was no single failure. There was just a Tuesday, like dozens of other Tuesdays, in which Thomas was fine, and I was grateful for his fineness and moved on. He was 15 when I first noticed something I couldn't organize away. He had stopped eating dinner with the family on most nights. Not dramatically, not after a fight, just quietly. He would appear at the kitchen doorway, say he wasn't hungry, and disappear back upstairs. I asked him once if something was wrong, and he said no. Nothing was wrong, he just wasn't hungry. I accepted this because I had 3 other children and homework to supervise, and because Thomas had always been fine. He was 17 when his English teacher called me. Her name was Mrs. Parrott, and she was a careful woman who chose her words deliberately. She said she was concerned about some of Thomas's writing. She said the themes were darker than she would expect. She asked if everything was all right at home. I said yes, of course. We had a stable home. Thomas was a quiet child, but he'd always been quiet. I would speak to him. I did speak to him. I knocked on his bedroom door that evening, and he let me in, and I sat on the edge of his bed, and I asked him if he was doing all right. And he looked at me for a moment. He had this way of looking at you, very steady, like he was deciding something, and he said yes, he was fine. I asked about the writing. He said it was just creative writing. That's what you do in English class. I said, okay. I told him I loved him. I left. What I did not do was sit with the discomfort of that conversation. I did not push past the first answer. I had asked and he had answered, and I had a permission slip to sign. And Diane had called that afternoon with a problem at her university. And Marcus had a track meet on Thursday that I needed to confirm the time for. Thomas was fine. He had said so. He left for college in 1999, and something changed in the leaving. Not a dramatic change, just a gradual, quiet increasing of distance that I attributed to normal young adulthood. He called less than the others. When he came home for holidays, he was present but contained. Pleasant at dinner, helpful with the dishes, gone to his room by 9. I told myself he was independent. I told myself this was his temperament. It was Gerald who said it first. We were driving home from Christmas in 2003, and the house had been full for 4 days, and I was talking about what a good holiday it had been, and Gerald was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Did you notice Thomas never once initiated a conversation with you this week?" I said that wasn't true. Gerald said, "Think about it." I thought about it, and I realized he was right. I told myself Thomas was introverted. I told myself some children simply grow up to be less demonstrative than others. I told myself I had done nothing wrong. The moment of no return was not an argument. It was not a revelation delivered at a hospital bedside or across a holiday table. It was a letter. Thomas was 31. It was 2012. He had moved to Seattle, which felt like a deliberate distance, though I had never let myself say that out loud. He was working as a graphic designer. He had a partner named Will, who I had met twice and liked immediately. And one morning in February, I found a letter in my mailbox, a real letter, handwritten, in Thomas's careful, small handwriting. I stood at the mailbox in my coat and read it in the cold. He didn't write it in anger. That's the thing I wasn't prepared for. There was no rage in it, no accusation, no list of grievances. He wrote it the way he did everything, quietly, precisely, with great care for the exact word. He said he loved me. He said that was not in question. And then he said something I have turned over so many times that I could recite it from memory today. He said, "I spent most of my childhood understanding that the way to be loved in our family was to need nothing. I got very good at that. I'm not sure it was good for me." He said he wasn't writing to assign blame. He was writing because he was in therapy, and his therapist had suggested that saying the thing out loud to the actual person, even if nothing changed, might be worth something. He said he wanted me to know, not to hurt me, just to know. I stood at that mailbox for a long time. The February cold was the kind that gets into your coat no matter how good your coat is. A car went past. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street. And I stood there holding a letter from my youngest child and understood for the first time without any arrangement around it what I had done. Not what I had done to him, what I had failed to do. He had been drowning in plain sight, and I had called it independence. I had called it temperament. I had called it fine. Because fine was easier than looking at what his silence was actually telling me, which was that he had learned very early that our household had a limited amount of attention, and he was not the child who knew how to compete for it. I had been fair. I had divided myself equally, and equal is not the same as enough when one child is going under and the others are swimming. I called him that afternoon. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear in the half-second before he spoke that he wasn't sure what version of this call he was about to receive. I said his name. I said I had read his letter. And then I said the thing I should have said on a Tuesday evening in 1989 when an 8-year-old boy was doing a puzzle alone at a neighbor's kitchen table. I wasn't paying enough attention. I knew it then, somewhere underneath everything. And I let it go because you were easy, and easy was what I needed you to be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, Mom." Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, and maybe not ever in the way I wanted it, but something, a door slightly open, that I had not earned but was being offered anyway. We have a different relationship now, slower, more deliberate. I ask him questions I should have asked when he was 15, and I sit with the answers instead of moving past them. It is not repaired because repair implies it was whole once, and I'm not sure it ever was. It is something being built for the first time. Maybe you know something about this. Not this story, but the particular way a person can be genuinely trying and still miss the one thing that most needed to be seen. The child or the friend or the person beside you who learned to accommodate your limitations, and you mistook their accommodation for contentment. The one who stopped asking because asking hadn't worked, and you noticed the quiet and felt relieved by it. Fairness is not the same as attention. Presence is not the same as seeing. And a child who needs nothing from you has often simply stopped believing that asking would help. Maybe you've been carrying something like that too. I still think about that Tuesday in 1989. I think about Thomas at Patrice's table with his puzzle, the careful way he placed each piece. I think about the drive home when I didn't ask him anything. I think about how many times after that I accepted his fine, and his okay, and his nothing's wrong, and told myself that was enough. The February cold is the kind that stays. Even after you go inside, you can feel where it was. I went inside eventually. I wrote him back. I told him I was glad he sent the letter. I told him I was sorry it had taken me this long to be a person he could send it to. Outside, the mail truck was already at the next house. The world keeps moving. It doesn't wait for you to finish understanding things. I know that now.